My experience in the corporate world is that it has changed dramatically from an environment where people were very competitive with one another, almost cannibalized one another, to much more of a collaborative type of environment today. Still, there is the emphasis on short-term results, but I think organizations are looking at longer-term results as well. The organization I was with during the 1990s, very, very successful organization, our style there was to bring in people that weren't always in agreement with one another. Our leader had individuals that served as his advisors. They were maybe 40, 50 years older than he was at the time. And he balanced his executive staff with people whom were controversial. He said that if you are the smartest person in the room, then you need to find another room. And he liked that kind of pushback. From my knowledge of what was happening inside of Enron, that was not the case, and people were afraid to speak up, and at least 15% of the population was overturned on a 6-month basis. And their bids were taken to give one another positive feedback and 360 feedback review sessions. Now that doesn't make for an environment where people are telling the truth about leadership or to leadership. And I think that the dynamics hopefully have changed somewhat today.
Well, it's a funny thing about control systems. We use a lot of control systems in organizations to try and affect behavior. We also use regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley. The fact of the matter is that when we imposed control on people from the outside, what we really get is people who get more clever at how to behave in the same old way while still falling within the bounds of the new regulations or the new control systems. So I do think that we haven't come nearly as far as we could in these kinds of, in regulating these kinds of behaviors. The most important and the most effective controls come from inside the person. And so until we have created corporate cultures where people not only believe that these are the right things to do, but that are supported through corporate culture, will we see any kind of significant behavioral changes?
Well, I think that in order to understand what's changed is we should look at the history of what occurred. The frauds that occurred in the early 2000s were mostly accounting-based frauds. Right after, companies really focused on the process controls, the transaction controls. Are there approvals for all the transactions? Did all the transactions that are accounted for in the books and records actually exist? Those process controls have improved over those 10 years. But as we saw in the late 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, tone at the top and the governance controls really drive the behaviors of the people underneath and within the organization. And so while the process controls and the transaction controls have operated and have improved, what's occurred is the behaviors of the individuals at those companies has changed. If you look at the statistics, there have been less accounting-based frauds that have occurred in the late 2000s than occurred earlier in that decade. And so therefore, the tone at the top is really what's driving the behaviors of the people in the organization and creates an environment that will either condone the frauds or prevent the frauds from occurring.
Dan, there's really two answers to that question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. There's a whole new set of laws, rules, and regulations that corporations must adhere to. We've certainly seen things like 404 auditor attestation for internal controls. We've seen companies having to beef up documentation and implement testing controls. We've seen certifications by CEOs and CFOs, and all of that is regulatory driven. But to me, the real essence of your question harkens back to the point of the first question, and that is, have governance issues changed as a matter of principle? And do rules really allow people to operate differently if they're unprincipled? And in my view, one of the things that's happened with this a significantly greater burden that's placed on corporations is that we've really set up too many rules. And too many rules means that there are seams that if somebody chooses to misbehave, that they can still do that. And in fact, in some respects, makes it easier. So I do think that on a case-by-case basis, if a corporation behaved at a highly principled level, good corporate governance, they did it before, they're doing it now. The burden that's been placed as a result of these additional regulatory requirements, I think is very questionable whether the cost of that compliance is generating any significant benefit for the public's interest.
Change the way they do business? I think most companies have changed how they approach the decision-making process. I think that a reliance on boards is showing up not just from the way companies select who comes onto the board, but if you watch the organizations that engage in self-regulatory practices like the New York Stock Exchange and so on, what you'll see is a growth in their requirements that we have these independent directors, especially on critical committees around compensation, the audit committee and so on. Having them part of the audit committee has been pretty standard practice, but to have them in on some of the critical day-to-day functions is important as well.